Give credit here to Swamp 24/7. Jacob Rudner on Sunday originally broke the news for Florida hiring Joe Houston as senior analyst for special teams. Houston, 37, would join the Gators in an off-field capacity. Had been with the Patriots since 2020. There in the NFL. Iowa State before that as special teams coordinator and quality control roles. He was in line to coach special teams under Nick Saban at Alabama in 2020 before going to the Patriots. Houston will work with current game changer coordinator Chris Couch, who is set to return for another season for Florida. At Florida, spokesperson has said Houston will work closely with Couch while also focusing on special teams and situational football. We all know the issues in those two areas last year, Will. So, look, not uncommon for there not to be a dedicated special teams coach on game day on the sideline. That's happening at other programs as well. You can argue because of the issues, if that should be the case at Florida, but it's not a unique thing to Florida and Billy Napier and how he wants to build his staff. But if you look on the sideline, Will, they're still involved. So this whole on-field, off-field thing, I think kind of maybe gets glossed over a little bit on game days. But look, that was apparent last season. After struggles, Brandon Taylor, a grad assistant, he had some more responsibilities on game days instead of Couch. Couch will still be on staff, and I know that rubs some people the wrong way, but keeping him on staff, Will, and I tweeted this yesterday, that's not going to ultimately determine Billy Napier's fate here. Now, we can look at it maybe a couple of ways. I know it's been asked why he's still on staff. Is this a UAA move and trying to save money and not have a buyout, or is Napier keeping a long-time assistant because he just doesn't want to let go? I don't care the reason. Bringing in Houston, that's a clear upgrade. I have a hard time seeing a scenario where Couch brings him down. No potential improvement happening because Chris Couch is still here with this new addition of Houston. Well, the roles, special teams coordinator, and especially situational football stand out. Changes being made in those two crucial areas here.
Yeah, I mean, certainly changes need to be made when it came to special teams. Though I would argue that special teams were maybe a symptom of what we saw on the field, not necessarily the disease. and the disease had more to do with a team that looked unprepared in many games, especially when they were on the road, and a team that quite honestly looked a little bit lackadaisical a few times when they were out there on the road specifically. This can only help having someone in there. The only disadvantage to having more than one person responsible for something is you get multiple voices telling people what to do, and they don't really know what to do. So as long as they've delineated exactly who you're supposed to listen to, who will be accountable, all that sort of stuff, I don't think it's really that big of a deal. And when you're looking at like coaches who are off-field analysts, you're really talking about opportunity costs. And the only opportunity cost is money. Right. I mean, because you're allowed to have an unlimited number of off-field assistants. And so bringing in another one while leaving one in place doesn't really change anything unless, like I said, the voice of the person who's in place is stronger than the person who's now taken charge. And when that happens, I think then you make a change. I have no ill will towards Couch. I think the special team certainly underperformed last year, but I don't think that was the only unit that underperformed last year. I mean, I think if you're going to have the same discussion, you got to start talking about the defensive coordinator. You got to start talking about the linebackers coach. You got to start talking about the corners and safeties coaches. You got to start talking about, you got to start.
And on that note, Will, I mean, is this, and I've seen the word out there, maybe for lack of a better term, babysitters? Ron Roberts, Austin Armstrong, Houston, Chris Couch. I mean, is that look? There's many of Gator Nation wanted changes to be made. Changes were made. Now, maybe not to the full effect. Many wanted out there with these guys still on staff, but changes to be made. I think it's defensive coordinator Armstrong, Roberts. That dynamic is still how that's going to work. I still think is in question, but this one here is pretty clear, cut and dry to me.
Yeah, I mean, as long as, again, I have bigger concerns about the Armstrong Roberts, who's the biggest voice in the room, than I do about these guys, right? I think it's pretty clear who's going to be the person who gets the criticism if the special teams are awful, and who's going to get the credit if the special teams are much improved, right? When it comes to the defensive side of the ball, now I start wondering about it, right? Like if all of a sudden the defense improves, does Austin Armstrong get the credit for it improving, or do people start crediting Roberts for the improvement on defense. There, I think the biggest voice in the room starts to make a little bit of a difference. The thing I've sort of said all along about all of these changes, or the changes that people have been clamoring for and those sorts of things, is that I'd actually feel if Billy Napier makes changes because he thinks changes are necessary, good for him. If Billy Napier makes changes because he's feeling the heat, then that's indicative of a poor leader. So if he doesn't make some changes that people want, I'm actually okay with that, so long as he's willing to accept the consequences on the other side, right? So if there's no offensive coordinator and that doesn't materialize, and Florida's offense sort of sits there in the 50 to 60 range, nobody takes a leap forward, and the offense can't get things going in the fourth quarter when they need it and those sorts of things. Look, Napier's not going to be around for very long, but he stuck to his guns and what he believed in, and it didn't work out for him. Okay, I can actually respect somebody who does that. It's the person who says, well, the fans really want this, so I'm going to bring them in anyway. And then you end up with all sorts of additional problems because that's not leadership. And what's
the saying on that, Will? If you listen to the fans, you end up being one.
Well, of a different team, probably, the way this fan base goes after people. But look, I mean, we saw it with Dan Mullen, who didn't get rid of Todd Grantham, and that ends up costing him his job. But I can at least respect Mullen for holding on to Grantham, even if it was the wrong move. I can respect him for holding on to Grantham because he's like, look, I'm going to go down with the ship. He went down with the ship. That's all right. It kind of accelerated the ship going down in many ways there.
Yeah, there is a fine line of staying comfortable and riding that comfortability of getting you out of a hole instead of remodeling.
Yeah, well, I mean, to me, the question is always, do you want to do the remodel, or are you doing the remodel for the neighbors that you have over twice a year? And if you're doing the remodel for the neighbors you have over twice a year, just rent a place and like go have dinner someplace that, like, you know, go out to a really nice dinner. Like, you know, there are other ways to do it that don't cost you the money on the remodel. Whereas if you look at it and go, this house really does need to be remodeled, there are things fundamentally wrong with it, we need to fix it. Okay, well, now it makes sense to spend the money and actually do the remodel. So that, to me, is the key here, is that if you look at it, Napier has specifically said, and you know, think about what I said earlier about the places that Florida was below average on defense: linebacker, safety, and corner. Those are the three places. And the secondary coach and the linebacker coach left for an upgraded job, but still, those guys aren't on the staff anymore, right? Don't think that's necessarily a coincidence. The places where guys were underperforming are places where we saw guys go. The interior linemen weren't necessarily great. The defensive ends weren't necessarily great. Okay, Spencer goes too. And so fine. But I think if Florida's defense had been even remotely serviceable, Florida wins more games last year, right? If it was just serviceable. And if Florida's defense had been elite, Florida wins 9 games. So there's an opportunity there to see rapid improvement on both of those sides. And again, I'm not here necessarily to defend Billy Napier in terms of what he wants to do. I'm just here to say that as a leader, sometimes you have to make decisions that are unpopular with your fan base. Like, I wouldn't want to be Dan Campbell today after calling those fourth down and calling that timeout after the running play on third down there down the red zone.
But there you go, sticking to his guns, and something that had worked all season long.
Yeah, the running play is the one I have more trouble with. But but again, Dan Campbell stood up afterwards, said, "I do it again." He protects his players. That's leadership. I think it's the same thing for Billy Napier. And he's going to have to do the same thing for these guys. Like, in some ways, he needs to come out and say, guys, look, our special teams is a team effort, but this guy's going to be held responsible when the special teams either succeed or fail. And as long as you set that as the expectation, then, you know, everybody knows, right? Couch is an assistant to the assistant, and everything runs smoothly. Same thing if you set that early on with Roberts and Armstrong. Roberts is an assistant to the assistant. Armstrong is the one who's going to be making the calls. He's going to be the one who's responsible. And quite honestly, look at how humble Armstrong is at allowing someone with the resume of Roberts to come in and help with the defense. Hey, that shows a level of maturity for somebody who needs to grow in the position. I think you could spin it that way too, right? Now, when everything goes down the drain, it'll be that there's conflict between those two guys, and it's a mess, and how could you bring those guys in and all that sort of stuff. But again, I sort of go back. That's kind of the same thing with the Campbell example with the Lions. if he converts both of those fourth downs and they're playing in the Super Bowl, everybody goes, "Oh, Dan Campbell always going for it on fourth down. Way to be aggressive." That leads over into his team, and they play aggressively that way because it's really easy to look at the result and say, "I knew that was going to happen." But one of the reasons that we have analytics is to help us make decisions or help coaches make decisions when they don't know what the outcome's going to be. So it's the same thing here. As I'm looking at all the changes Napier's making, and we can be critical early on, but if I'm not going to sit here and rail against the Ron Roberts hiring now, I sure as heck shouldn't come in, say, October, November, when it doesn't look like it's doing well, and rail against it then. I need to have the stones to come in and say, I don't like it now, because then downstream, maybe I can say something about it. I don't feel bad about this one. I actually think that's a good hire. At the same time, I shouldn't be able to then go, "Oh, I always knew that wasn't going to work," or you should never mix those sorts of things downstream. Same thing for the special teams, right? I think
you do have an example a year ago with Austin Armstrong.
Yeah, I've missed a few too, so we won't go back to those. But no, I mean, look, I think there's so to me, that's the point, right? Is let's throw it all out on the table and say, do we think this is a good hire for Florida or not? And I think this is a very good hire at the special teams position. This is a guy who's dealt with adults in the NFL. This is a guy who also has college experience. This is a guy who Alabama thought highly enough to bring in and potentially give an opportunity before he went to New England. So you think about Belichick and Saban have given this guy their stamp of approval. And so I think that's certainly an upgrade over what Florida's had. But sometimes things go wrong. And so hopefully Napier has targeted the right guy, and hopefully that turns into a successful improvement in special teams this year, not just kicking, but, the 11 guys on the field and, no stupid penalties and all that sort of stuff.